Saturday afternoon. I'm Miriam Sabagi, the NIAC Chicago captain. Today we are thrilled to host Professor Juan, who will read from his new translation of the Rubaiyat of Omar, Khayyam, followed by a discussion about how the themes in the work relate to current events, including plague, war, economic depression, and civil unrest. We will next move to Q&A and finally have esteemed NIAC Chicago member Dr. Ali Fatimi conclude this event with a brief presentation. This event should last no more than 90 minutes. A little bit about NIAC Chicago for those who are new. NIAC Chicago is a volunteer-led chapter of NIAC Action that seeks to support the organization in fulfilling its mission to advance peace and champion the priorities of the Iranian American community. NIAC Chicago supports this work by hosting local events, collaborating and coalition building with local organizations with shared priorities, and engaging and activating the local Iranian American community. In this light, we are accepting donations throughout this poetry event and after. We also highly encourage you to become a member of NIAC. Please see the chat box for both links. Thank you for your consideration. During the course of today's event, you will have access to the Q&A feature of this webinar. If you have any questions for Professor Cole, please put them in the Q&A box. We will use your questions from the Q&A box during the Q&A portion of this event. If you wish to ask your question directly to Professor Cole, we will enable your video to Professor Cole so he can see you. We will directly message you in the chat box ahead of time to ask for your permission and let you know when you will be prompted to ask your question. Please keep in mind that this event is being recorded and we will be sharing it on our website and social media platforms. So if you do not wish to be visible on the recording, please turn your camera off. Now I'd like to present today's guest of honor. Juan Cole is a Richard P. Mitchell Collegiate Professor of History at the University of Michigan. For 3.5 decades, he has sought to put the relationship of the West and the Muslim world in historical context. His most recent book is The Rubaiyat of Omar Hayam, published in 2020. He is also author of Muhammad, the Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Vampires, The New Arabs, How the Millennial Generation is Changing the Middle East, and many other books. He has translated works of Lebanese-American author Khalil Gibran. He has appeared widely on media, including PBS NewsHour, ABC World News Tonight, Nightline, The Today Show, Anderson Cooper 360, Rachel Maddow, Chris Hayes' All In, CNN, The Colbert Report, Democracy Now!, and many others. He has written about Egypt, Iran, Iraq, the Gulf, and South Asia, and about both extremist groups and peace movements. He has had regular columns at The Nation and Truthdig, and is a proprietor of the Informed Comment news and analysis site. Cole conducts his research in Arabic, Persian, Urdu, and Turkish, as well as several European languages. He has lived in various parts of the Muslim world for more than a decade and continues to travel widely there. He has written, edited, and translated 19 books and authored over 100 articles and chapters. I also hope that you will enjoy this poetry reading with our suggested drink for the event, pomegranate sangria. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Juan Cole. Professor Cole, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Miriam. It's a delight to be here, and thanks everybody who's joining in for coming. It's bittersweet. This book that I have published has come out during the pandemic, and therefore I can't go around to bookstores and give readings and have the brie and crackers and so forth. But since let's see, since we're doing it virtually, I'll show a copy of the book. It's the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which is a classic of Persian literature and also a classic of English literature in the translation of Edward Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald was a gentleman of means in the 19th century who had way too much time on his hands and who got interested in spending his time learning languages. He learned Spanish and translated some things from Spanish. Of course, he had Latin and Greek as a British gentleman of the period who'd gone to Cambridge. He was friends with Thackeray and Lord Tennyson. in the 1850s, he met a young man. I personally think he probably was lovers with the young man, who had studied Persian with a captain who came back from India. You know, in that era, Persian for the British didn't primarily signify Iran, although of course it was included, but it was British India that impelled them to learn Persian. And the British upper crust often knew Persian right up until the 1950s. Anthony Eden, the prime minister who tangled with Abdel Nasser over the Suez Canal, some of his subordinates complained that he made them read Hafez before they went to bed at night in Persian. So Fitzgerald and this young man came upon this poem in the Bodleian Library. It was a manuscript, and it was a unique manuscript uh, dated 1460 of the Common Era, and written out in Shiraz. And I believe it's the earliest manuscript that collects these quatrains, we would call them in English four-line poems, uh, under the rubric of Omar Khayyam. And Fitzgerald's translation of them, along with that manuscript, he had another that was sent to him from India. The translation of them went viral. Everybody loved his translation, and it became one of the most popular and well-cited books in the English language. In the 1950s, Bartlett's quotations had more quotations from Fitzgerald's translation than it had from the Bible, and it went everywhere. T.S. Eliot was inspired to write poetry by it. Mark Twain was his favorite book, and many British writers fell under its influence. And it was popular beyond literary circles, but it was approved of by literary circles. So it was unusual in this regard. Ordinary people would memorize it. An ambassador to England from the United States observed when he went to the Omar Khayyam Society in London that he'd heard cowboys recite in the morning to make their coffee by the fireside. So then in the 1970s, Fitzgerald's translation began to fall out of favor. I'm not entirely sure why this happened. It may be that, you know, there was this move away from dead white men, and Omar Khayyam is not exactly a dead white man, but they had to make way for more diverse literature. That could be part of it. But for one reason or another, it stopped being so widely read, and I think stopped being assigned in high school, which it always had been up until then. So I meet younger people who have never heard of it, but if I meet somebody in their 60s, they usually start reciting it to me. And so there's a big age divide. Well, I'd long been interested in it. Of course, you know, I was from the 60s, and it was something that I encountered. My generation was very interested in what we called the Orient, which is now politically incorrect. And I went to Tehran in 1976 on a kind of student voyage through the Middle East. And I picked up a copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, this little Persian paperback with this kind of chintzy cover on it that looked like a Bollywood film advertisement. And I worked through it, and I thought it was beautiful in Persian. And also, I thought there were things that Fitzgerald missed, or his eyes slided over maybe, or which he just couldn't accept as a mid-19th century Britisher. And so in recent years, I started working on it, and I was very interested to know, where did this poetry come from? I should tell you that at the universities in America and Britain, this poetry is no longer taught as part of Persian literature, and it's largely because literary specialists discovered that it's just not by the astronomer Omar Khayyam. Omar Khayyam was a great astronomer and a mathematician, and he worked for the Seljuk uh, Empire at Isfahan and then later at Marv. He was from Nishapur. And when I was in high school, at one point they taught us some uh, geometric algebra, solving algebraic equations by putting them over into geometry so you can actually see how they work. He invented that. He's a long Arabic treatise on it. However, there's no evidence that he wrote poetry, much less this kind of poetry. And the first assertions that he did so are well after his death. Aruzi Nezami knew him and wrote a book called Chahar Maghale, four essays, which has a biography of Khayyam in it. From this contemporary, no mention of writing poetry. And it's really long after his death, and I would argue mainly in the Mongol period, before the Ilkhanids and after, that this poetry grew up as folk poetry. It's poetry written by many hands. Maybe some of them were elite, some of them were artisans, some of them were probably women, some of them were gay, some of them were straight. And it's like the 1001 Nights in that regard, because the tales in the 1001 Nights, some of them originally from India, they were put into Arabic in Baghdad, some were written in Cairo or told in Cairo, in Aleppo, and a couple of them seem actually to be an edition of 18th century French translators. So the Rubaiyat is like that. But I think that, seeing it as long-term folk poetry, to which poems were constantly added. By the 19th century in Lucknow in India, there was a famous publisher, Nawal Kishore. They brought out an edition of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam with 1,000 poems in it. And this manuscript that they found in the Bodleian had 158. So he was very busy after his death, Omar was. He became a genre. And the themes of the poetry are, in some ways very modern. It's precocious poetry in the sense that some of it is relatively atheistic. Says that, heaven and hell are fairy tales for children. Might as well enjoy yourself a little while you're down here, because after that, there's not much going on for the rest of eternity. You'll just be in black earth. It's skeptical. It bashes astrology, and bashing astrology may be a way of bashing religion. Because it's dangerous to bash religion in medieval Iran, but as astrology you could strike out at it as superstition. Some of the poetry is from a obviously lower class milieu. These are drunks. They used to put the taverns on the edge of town, and people would go out there to drink. It would be owned by Armenians or Zoroastrians. There would be ruined buildings around. They called them kharabat, or ruins, basically, the taverns. And relatively low-class people would hang out there. Khayyam, the real Khayyam, got 10,000 dinars a year as a court astronomer. And I don't think he probably was pawning his winter coat the way this poetry talks about. It's wonderful for a social historian, because kind of in the social history of ideas, it sometimes gives you a sense of the ethos of maybe the artisan class or the working class. And because it's by many different hands, it's full of contradictions. Some of it is very skeptical, almost atheistic. Some of it is kind of Sufi, and it goes back and forth. And it's something when Fitzgerald's translation became really popular, Charles Eliot Norton and other great literateurs wondered, why does it have this dichotomy like this? And there were all kinds of theories. Was Khayyam a Sufi, or he wasn't a Sufi? And I think it was, for a lot of thinkers in Europe and the United States, the poetry was adopted as a means of self-secularization. It became popular among champions of Darwin, for instance, who would quote it. And I think the fact that they thought it was by a medieval scientist, gave it that cachet. So I wanted to translate it into contemporary American English, or contemporary English in any case, because I think that the Fitzgerald translation by now has a lot of Victorian archaicisms. It's maybe a little difficult for contemporaries. Let me just read a few examples of my rendering. We won't say what's in that cup. Too bad if your heart isn't scorched, if there is no one you're pining for who makes it leap. That day on which love does not ache in you is the most wasted day of your whole life. So that's a very typical kind of Khayyami poem. And it's arguing against a kind of very sober Puritan self-restraint. It's saying follow your heart. There's some emotions, some passions in life that you just have to go for, and you'll regret if you don't, because again, all that's left is black earth afterwards. Here's one bashing astrology. Don't blame the stars for virtues or for faults, or for the joy and grief decreed by fate. For science holds the planets all to be 1,000 times more helpless than are we. So in this poem, the persona of the astronomer comes through. That's what Khayyam was supposed to be. And we know mathematically exactly where Mars is going to be next year at precisely this time. We could do it down to the second. But we don't have any idea where any of the people in this group is going to be next year this time. Human beings are the most complex things in the universe, and the poetry acknowledges this. By the way, Fitzgerald didn't translate it that way, that the stars are 1,000 times more helpless than we are. He translated they're just as helpless as we are. So he made it into a kind of Oriental fatalism, where everything in the world is just fated to a certain degree. But that's not what Hayam says, or no, not what the poetry says. It says that human beings have infinitely more freedom of choice than natural objects, and therefore ought to exercise it and not be superstitious about it. So I'll end with this one, which is, again, I think it's from a lower class milieu, and it's crass. Some of the poetry is. One of the problems with Fitzgerald's translation is they all sound like Shakespeare there. But this poem says, signs of the zodiac. You give something to every jackass. You hand them fancy baths, millworks, canals, while noble souls must gamble in hopes of winning their nightly bread. Who would give a fart for such a constellation? So that's obviously, from a poor person's point of view, saying that if it is in fact the case that the stars are governing the universe, well, they're not doing a very good job at being just about it, at least. So I'll stop there, and I think Miriam and I will have a little conversation before we open it up.
Yes, thank you so much for the introduction, Professor Cole. And yes, we are now moving on to the fireside portion of the event. So we do have questions for Juan Cole drafted by NIAC Chicago members, as well as questions from the RSVPs that the audience has already submitted. So now I'm gonna be asking question number one. So you somewhat answered what inspired you to undertake a new translation of the Rubaiyat. Thank you so much. But is there anything else you wanted to add to that? What inspired you to undertake this new translation?
Well, aside from my childhood love of it, and or at least young adult love of it, and one of my fields for my degree at UCLA was in Persian literature. I studied with Amin Ben-Ani, and we did Rumi. We did a lot of the Persian classics. So it's an interest of mine. Um, but I suppose a number of things happened. One was that the Bodleian manuscript was published in facsimile in 1898. So it had been around. It was a little rare, to publish a Persian manuscript in facsimile at that time was expensive, and I think it was a subscription. So I don't know how many copies there were, 103 or something. But Google scanned it when they did Google Books and put it up. And so I found it, and that was part of what started me off working on it. Was just accessible. And then a number of other 19th century publications of poetry attributed to Khayyam also became available. So that was part of it. Part of it was this puzzle of where it came from that I was interested in trying to resolve, and which in the end I think I got a pretty good handle on. Part of it was the rise of Iranophobia and Islamophobia. As a somebody who really fell in love with Persian and Iran back in the 70s as a young person, it hurt my heart to see Iran and Persian vilified and demonized increasingly in American culture. And it seemed to me important to remind people that just as the Japanese haiku had an enormous influence on English letters through the 20th century, so did the Persian quatrain. So the famous Robert Frost poem, Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Night, is an imitation of Fitzgerald's translation. It has exactly the rhyme scheme of a classical Persian quatrain, of a Persian rubai. And its themes, because the protagonist in that poem is caught between a frozen lake and a snowstorm in the woods, also is very bleak and resembles some of the Khayyami poetry. So whereas everybody knows how important the haiku is, and most people try to write a few haiku Japanese style sometime in their lives, maybe in school, the Persian quatrain, which I think was at least as influential, has fallen out of favor, and knowledge of it has been lost. But also because of the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran and the Islamic Republic, Iran has been tagged as religious fanatics. And we all know this is simply not true. I thought the poetry, if we could bring it again to a contemporary audience with its emphasis on skepticism and its sometimes outre kinds of recommendations, that maybe in a small way here and there it might help to fight that Iranophobia.
Well, thank you so much. Well, that brings us to the next question. What are some of the most surprising references to poetry attributed to Khayyam in the Western popular culture? In the introduction to the book, you mentioned Conan the Barbarian and the Grateful Dead. What are your favorites?
Yeah. Well, Fitzgerald's translation, as I said, gradually went viral. He self-published it. So for all those of you who have a novel, you're putting up at Amazon or something, take heart. One of the greatest poems in the English language was self-published. But it was discovered by the pre-Raphaelites, by this circle of a little bit odd poets and artists in London of the time, who had this theory that everything since the Renaissance was artificial. And if you wanted real art, you went back to the raw, the unsophisticated medieval period. So for them, this poetry is medieval, so it's pre-Renaissance, and they looked at it that way rather than considering it so much as Iranian. So they went wild with it, and it influenced their poetry. The Pre-Raphaelites are some of the poets that I like that were influenced by it. But also, one of them was William Morris. Morris was an early British socialist. He also played a role in popularizing the Norse legends. And he was one of the people who invented high fantasy. So if you liked Game of Thrones and Tolkien's movies, The Lord of the Rings, Morris was one of the people who developed that genre. And I think that the Persian poetry and its exotic character and so forth was influential on Morris. He did 4 manuscripts, calligraphed British style, with designed floral patterns and things on the outside of Fitzgerald's translation, one of which he gave to the wife of a friend of his who I think he was having an affair with. So Morris is an example. Eliot, it's been argued that T.S. Eliot's work is suffused with themes from the Rubaiyat. As I said, Mark Twain tried to write some poetry in imitation of it. His isn't very good. Yeah, and then Conan. Well, Robert E. Howard loved the poetry, and when he invented the world of Conan, he was influenced by it. And people nowadays, I think because of the Schwarzenegger movie and so forth, think about Conan as a brute, but he's in the books. He's not. He knows lots of languages. And by the way, he's a Sumerian, which was an ancient Iranian people. So if you didn't know that Conan the Barbarian is Iranian, there you go.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that then we're going to go on to the third question. What was your process of translation? What are your objectives with this new translation? How do you stake your translation's position in the field today, especially with popular renditions of Rumi poems by Ladinsky and Barks, which aren't really translations?
Right. Well, I'm an academic, and as I said, trained in Persian literature. And so I didn't want to depart from the poetry very far. I didn't want to do a literal translation because, by the way, that was done a lot by scholars in the 19th and early 20th century, not only into English, but German and French and so forth. Fairly literal renderings were done. So I didn't see the point of doing that. I wanted to do it as poetry. And since my undergraduate days, I've written poetry. I got a prize as an undergraduate for my poetry. So rather than do what the Barks team did, is to take a literal translation by someone who knows Persian and give it to a poet, I combined the two in myself. I knew the Persian, I could read it, I knew it literally, but I also wanted to figure out how you would say that in today's English. So again, I wanted to have a contemporary feel. So I avoided all of those tropes of Persian medieval translation. There's no wenches, no sakis, no taverns in my book. I had big arguments with my editor because I wanted just to call it a bar where they were, because that's, as far as I can tell, in English, that's in Australia, United States, Britain, that's what they call them nowadays. But my editor didn't like that. It was too jarring for him. So I use various terms for the place that they're drinking. But I did want to get away from those archaicisms and to make it contemporary. Then I also didn't want to do what Fitzgerald did. He did them all in iambic pentameter. Da-dun, 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 da-dun. And critics, that is kind of boring after a while. On the other hand, some of them I just heard it that way and they fell into it. So the ones that are iambic pentameter, or sometimes I use other foot lengths, maybe sextameter or whatever, I put those in justified on the left. So there are four lines and you can see that they're justified. And those are the ones that have a meter, no rhyme. I didn't put in rhyme. But then others I did more or less as free verse. And again, my editor was uncomfortable with that, and so made me put the free verse into 4 lines, so at least it was still a quatrain. And those, it just seemed to me that you can capture the liberated spirit of some of those poems better with free verse and letting them splash across the page than you can by putting them in a straitjacket. And I avoided rhyme on the whole, unless it just fell naturally, because it makes you get away from the meaning of the original. Meter and rhyme translation from another language, after a while, doesn't sound very much like the original. So I thought I would privilege, as far as I could, what I took to be the meaning of the original and bring it over into free verse or a blank verse in English.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, I'm going to move on to the emotional aspects of the poem. So many of the poems I read ask us to fully embrace our emotions and live in the moment. And however, it seems that other poems tell us to somewhat drown away our sorrows with wine and accept that this world isn't real. For example, on page 25, poem number 20 says, quote, "Bring me a drink since I'm going to blot out the sorrows of the world with wine." Poem number 94, page 49 also says, quote, "This world's not real, it's just a simile. Why be disturbed by all this pain and need? Accept your destiny. The moving pen has written and it won't revise it for you," unquote. So with the pandemic and George Floyd, I've certainly found myself shutting down with all that's going on. How do we solve this contradiction in our current moment?
Right. Well, the poetry, again, as I said, is from many hands, I think. And that helps to explain the differences in the values from one poem to another. So it's an anthology, but it does have some rules as an anthology. And I think, I know for a fact, there was a principle of medieval Arabic and Persian literature when you made an anthology, was that one of the purposes of it was not to let people get bored. So you would pick out a poem that said one thing here, and another poem from a different poem that said the opposite here. And you would put them all together to keep the reader guessing and to keep the reader interested and on their toes. So I think this collection of quatrains, some of which we know from manuscripts before 1460, is of that character. But yes, the poetry, does kind of resemble our times in some ways. I think, as I said, it grew up primarily in the Mongol period, in the Ilkhanid period, when the Mongols took Iran, and there was a great deal of devastation. I don't want to be hard on pastoralists, because tribal people get a bad name and so forth, but the Mongol invasion was very hard on cities. And there were a few like Tabriz that just surrendered and were all right, but others people had to run away from. And in fact, the great historian Jovani, who wrote in that period, he was a Mongol official, an Ilkhanid official. He wrote a history of the Mongols. He saw a village being destroyed by them. And he was obviously very conflicted as an Iranian working for a government that was destroying Iranian villages. And at that point, he quotes one of the Khayyami poems, and he attributes it to Omar Khayyam. So people did use the poetry for these moments of devastation, and just historically speaking, it's worth noting maybe that there have been some historians like William McNeill at Chicago who argued that the Black Death, the plague, came west with the Mongols' invasions. That they didn't mean to, but inadvertently they brought it with them. Other historians have argued that it came on sea, but In any case, Iran also did get hit by it when some of this poetry was being composed. So the poetry is suffused with this sense that life is fleeting. And I mean, I summarize it by saying that because life is fleeting and because the meaning of life isn't clear, if indeed there is a meaning, therefore, you shouldn't be too Puritan. You should enjoy yourself a little in life. On the other hand, the poetry is careful to say, don't be mean to people, don't betray people, don't, have a sense of warmth and humanity towards others while you're enjoying yourself. So I think it sometimes was misunderstood in Fitzgerald's translation as libertine, as just saying, well, everybody else can go to hell, I've got mine, I'm just going to enjoy myself. Not what the poetry says. It says, sure, enjoy yourself, but don't be mean to other people.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, this brings us to the next question. Poem number 65, page 40, can be read as an instance of oppression and what goes around comes around, about leadership and unruly kings. Quote, settle down, you two are in for being trumped on, just like me. No pun intended. Okay, maybe it was. Poem number 69, page 41 says, quote, my king, the stars appointed you to rule and dressed for you the caparisoned steed of empire. Your golden hoofed stallion charged ahead and gilded with its sparks the battle plain. So how would the authors of the poem critique the reckless leadership we are living under today in the US and around the world?
Well, I think we've already heard what some of these poets thought about the injustice of the world and the way in which people thought that it's foreordained and there's nothing you can do about it. And there's a lot of that kind of sentiment in the poem, in the poetry. There's a clear, undercurrent of class critique of poor people being mistreated and of the wealthy being selfish in this poetry. It's one of the reasons I think it doesn't come from the Seljuk court in Isfahan. But I think the contradiction here is illusory because this particular collection of the poetry was made by a man we know nothing about, named Mahmud Yerbudaki. He was obviously a Turkmen, and he was a courtier of a prince of the Black Sheep dynasty, the Karakoyunlu. There's not a whole book in English about this dynasty in Iran. Any of you who are budding medieval historians looking for a PhD topic, it deserves to be written. But they were nomads, and they came from, the steppes of Central Asia as Turkmen. They converted to Islam, probably a kind of folk Shiism, but they weren't sort of Sharia Muslims. They weren't urban Muslims that were attentive to the minutiae of what they thought of as Islamic law. There was a prince of the dynasty who rebelled against his father and used horrible language for his father. Mm-hmm. Kind of a Tiffany Trump figure who rebelled and established a statelet in Shiraz. So when I first read the Bodleian manuscript, I was very puzzled because at the end of it, it says it was written, in such and such year by Yerbudaki in the capital, Shiraz. Well, I know a fair amount about Iranian history, but I thought to myself, well, what was Shiraz the capital of? So I looked into it and discovered that there was a ruler, Pir Budak, who had rebelled against his father and made the statelet in that period. So this poetry was collected and probably was recited at Pir Budak's court. And the chronicles say that he liked a good time, that his court parties were full of wine and unveiled women and dancing and music and horrible things from a Sharia-minded point of view. So the poetry that was chosen out, I think, has some fun with the Puritan urban notables, the kinds of people who disapproved of drinking wine and were very attentive to law, but who also maybe were cold-hearted towards the common people. And I think the Turkmen dynasties had this kind of interesting aspect that they were rulers, but they came from what would be considered the lower classes because urban people looked down on them. So maybe that made a space for them to appreciate this poetry that critiqued the upper classes.
Wonderful. This brings us to our next question. As you've mentioned, many of the poems were written during plague and war. I can't help but think with similar things happening right now with coronavirus, we're all in quarantine. At the beginning of 2020, the US almost went to war with Iran and we're stuck in endless wars in the Middle East. So which of the newly translated poems speak to the moment we are in right now?
Oh, well, I think you have to take them as a whole in that regard. I think, I wrote an essay for Tom Dispatch about a month ago, which went viral, in which I pointed out that this poetry is brutal about religious hypocrisy. One of the poems says that, I went to the mosque, but I didn't have prayer in mind. My rug at home had worn out, so I came back with one of the prayer rugs. So the reason for going to the mosque had nothing to do with piety, he just needed a new rug, so he stole one from the mosque. And that's a very typical kind of medieval Iranian humor. But it also speaks to the hypocrisy of religious people. And, we're in a moment now where the themes of the poetry of superstition versus science, which is a theme that comes across, is being pitched again because you have dozens now of fundamentalist pastors have died because they refused to stop holding church services during the pandemic. And they were absolutely convinced that God would protect them and their congregations. And sadly, this was not the case. So I think, the resistance to science that Dr. Fauci recently talked about is something that's critiqued in some of these poems. One of the ones that I read where it says, don't be blaming your fate or your destiny on the stars. It's you who make your destiny. In the same way, you can't be refusing to wear a mask and killing your grandmother on the grounds that you're enveloped by God's grace. So I think that kind of poetry hits our moment.
Yeah, that's so true. Unfortunately, people just still continue to ignore science, which is so unfortunate and angry, and it makes me angry. Which, I mean, also brings us somewhat to the next question. This is more about economic inequality. So poem number 90, page 48, speaks to leaders and citizens about the importance of poor people in our society. Quote, flout all traditions and forget the law, but don't deprive the poor of your small gifts, unquote. Poem number 118, page 57, from your book, newly translated book, seems to speak from the perspective of someone who has cast away high office in exchange for poverty. Quote, I've cast away high office and its pomp. I've purchased poverty with my very life and soul, unquote. Do you think that this fits with Khayyam's life? I mean, this might be a chance to talk about the fact that maybe, like as you said, you argue that Khayyam actually did not write the poetry attributed to him.
Yeah, well, this kind of sentiment is again, wouldn't have been typical of the Seljuk court. But those sentiments are not only in this poetry, but are widespread in medieval Persian poetry. And the great scholar Hamida Dabashi has talked about a kind of Persian humanism. That the Khayyami poetry is saying, be a human being. Be nice to people. Take care of the poor, and even if that means you're not maybe strictly following religious law, that human beings are more important than religious law. And it's something that Hafez says, and Saadi, and it's a widespread sentiment in the poetry, which Devashi has called a kind of Persian humanism. That there are other things in life than teasing out the minutiae of law. So the poetry certainly reflects this point of view of putting the human first, and therefore caring about what happens to the poorest in society, and maybe even declining to join in with a corrupt establishment, turning down wealth and power, if it would mean compromising that key principle of caring about human beings first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very true. This brings me to my last question, the last question of the fireside portion of the event. So I think that poem number 56, page 37, speaks of larger systematic oppression and how the oppressed nonetheless fight on despite the dangers. Quote, those whose deeds grow out of their hypocrisy want to separate body from soul. I'll carry on my crown a jug of wine, even if they threaten to lop off my head, unquote. So when I was reading this particular poem, the image of the Minneapolis police officer kneeling on George Floyd's neck immediately came to mind, and how that represents systematic oppression. What are your thoughts on how this poem is relevant to this moment in our contemporary politics?
Well, yes, again, the poetry really insists on not mistreating people as the highest value. It's all right to break regulations, but it's not all right to be mean to people or to harm them. So I think that's something that in our society today we really have to give some thought to, because a lot of people and their lives are being harmed for the sake of regulations, basically, and some of them. Well, in my generation, this is coming to an end, I hope now, but in my generation, so many lives were blighted, because people smoked marijuana. I mean, really? 5% of the prison population was in for that. Imagine the millions and maybe billions of dollars that were spent to keep people incarcerated. And for what? It was partially a racist program, because the white drugs were not punished in that way on the whole. This poetry really is a cri de coeur. It's a cry from the heart against that kind of thing of punishing victimless crimes. And so when it says drink wine, and it says that quite a lot, I think it's a symbol. The wine is being used as a symbol of something that doesn't really harm people, but which that society had outlawed. And a lot of Muslim jurists refuse to punish people for drinking wine because there's no punishment mentioned in the Quran. Quran discourages wine, it frowns on it, but it doesn't give a punishment for it. And in legal theory, if something doesn't have a punishment attached to it, it's not really a crime. So I think the poetry is using wine in that sense of something that society frowns on, but isn't really a crime. And it's encouraging people not to pay attention to silly regulations. I don't think it means that the poetry doesn't mean to encourage people to be falling down drunk all the time, although some of it might. But on the whole and by and large, what it's saying is be prepared to defy convention in order to be a rounded human being.
Wow. Wow, well, thank you so much. Now we're going to move on to the Q&A from the audience. I'm going to remind folks to send your questions in the Q&A chat and check the chat box if you want to ask your question live, if you want, or you can have your camera on. So I'm going to take question number from Amin. So we have Amin, he asked a question about the transcript. So his question is, which transcript is Professor's translation based on?
Yeah. Well, as I said, it's in the book, the notation. I used the Bodleian manuscript of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam that was edited in 1460 in Shiraz. This is in the British, at Oxford, in their special collections. It's a very story because during the Napoleonic Wars, the French and the British both were trying to get the Qajar Empire on their side. And so they sent embassies. Napoleon sent an embassy, and the British sent an embassy. So in 1810, it was the first modern British embassy in Iran. I know a lot of Iranians think that British embassies in Tehran have caused a lot of trouble, but this was the first one. And it was the ambassadorial staff who collected this manuscript. And it was a very old manuscript from 1460. And it ended up there in Oxford. And then it was cataloged by Edward Fitzgerald's friend. And the friend brought it over and they went through it together and were kind of being Victorian gentlemen, shocked and amazed at what was in this poetry. So that was the one that I used. And I used it because I think that's the first collection of this poetry that is under the rubric of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Some of the quatrains in the collection existed beforehand. We have them in Mongol collections of poetry, but they're not, for the most part, attributed to Hayam in earlier iterations. Either they're attributed to some other poet, Mahsati Ganjavi, a woman poet of the Seljuk era. Some of this poetry was attributed to her, or they were attributed to Ibn Sina, which is just as unlikely as that Avicenna was a great Aristotelian philosopher. I don't think he probably was stumbling drunk in the Kharabad in the taverns. So what Yer Budaki did, the genius that he had, was he took this poetry that had been published here and there under either as anonymous, and often they just said, I don't know who wrote this, La'araf man kitabahu, or it had been attributed to somebody else. And he just collected them and he said, oh, this is by Omar Khayyam. And then I think they read them out at Pir Budak's wine parties. So that was the one that I used. And I compared it a little bit to the, the Mort d'Arthur, the Arthur legends in English were collected from the French and published again beginning in the 1460s. So it was a similar kind of moment.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Now I'm calling on Nari to appear. He wants to ask his question. Nariman? You can turn on your camera if you like. And you're muted.
Muted, okay. Here we go. Okay. All right, sorry about that. We're all having learning curves with the Zoom right now. But Professor Cole, hello from Chicago, and thank you for accepting our invitation to come. Good to see you again, at least virtually, if not in one of the nightclubs, jazz clubs in Chicago. But we would love to see you at some point again, doing that experience. One of the value-added experiences of this afternoon has been how knowledgeable you are about the literary about the amorous relationship between these literary figures as to who was with whom or whatever, without getting too graphics about it. I'm wondering if we could expect a book from you in the future that will map out some of these amorous relationships, and what works they might have inspired more interestingly. That would be an interesting contribution to expect as a future book from you.
Well, I do hope. Thanks. Now, it's great to see you, and thanks for having me. I have been working on a book about the impact of the Rubaiyat on English letters, and
oh, wow.
It does go into some of these relationships that the poetry is centered on, because the poetry was received in many ways. Some people saw it as a support for secularism and, Darwinism. Some people saw it as romantic poetry. And the common person often took it that way because of the famous verse about that Fitzgerald had translated about sitting under the bough and with wine and a book of verse.
Sure.
And so, it was very common. I've gone back and read the old newspapers from the teens, and it was very common for suitors, if they invited a girl on a date, they would show up at her door with this book under their arm, and in hopes of maybe reading some of it to her to get her in the mood. So it did, it has a history, it has a place in the history of Western sentiment and romance. And I think we forget often how Puritan American and British culture was earlier on, but some parts of the society really responded to these things. So in 1905, Mardi Gras in New Orleans had a theme every year. So they made the theme the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. And so they had, the women in harem pants and the big jugs of wine, and it was all Khayyam themed, the floats that the Indians made and so forth. I found, the original newspaper clippings where they did paintings of those, or watercolors of those floats. So here is 1905 America. You couldn't get further away from Iran than that. It was still the Qajar period. We were on the verge of the constitutional revolution. But Americans were taking something, however distorted it might have been in its lens through Fitzgerald and so forth. They were taking something from Iranian ideas about the good life.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Well, we'll move on to the next question from the audience. This is from A. I'm quoting him. He says, "Salam, thanks for organizing and bringing this great talk to us. Is there any order to his poems? Could the contradictory nature of some of his poems be indicative of a change in his mindset over the years? Thank you, Dr. Cole, for your interest and support of cross-cultural understanding," unquote.
Well, thank you. The poetry in the Yerbuda Key manuscript is arranged alphabetically. It's in the Abjadi system by first letter. So no, there's no progression to it. It's arbitrary. But I think that's what Yerbuda Key wanted. He wanted the anthology to shift around from theme to theme so that people wouldn't get bored. And I think in the original manuscript, the very first poem was kind of pious. And I think they put that one there as a cover in case, somebody picked it up who was narrow-minded and saw the first poem, would think, well, there's nothing wrong with this book and go on. But then when you get deeper into it, you find the more titillating poems. No, I don't think the poetry can be traced to an author, to a single author. And this was something that really puzzled late 19th and early 20th century scholars of Persian literature, that how could it be that the same poem was attributed to 4 or 5 different poems, and that it existed in various manuscripts, and then it all ended up being attributed to Khayyam. So in literary studies, we have the concept of the frame author. It's an author to whom something is attributed. So like all of the 1001 Nights tales are attributed to Scheherazade, right? She was in danger of having her head cut off if she didn't keep her husband, the king, entertained with these cliffhangers, and she wouldn't tell him how the story ended unless he let her live another day. So you have a story from Cairo in 1250, and you have another story from Aleppo in 1744. They're all said to be the work of Scheherazade. So she's a frame author. She's the author that kind of organizes this anthology. So I think they picked up Khayyam because he was a skeptical scientist as the frame author for this kind of poetry.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This brings us also to Shadi's question. Shadi, you're up. Shadi Sherafat.
Yeah, did I just unmute myself?
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you so much. This was very exciting, very, very informative. In terms of you portraying it and the way I always read Khayyam as a skeptic, how do we interpret this, him being a skeptic, in relation to his Muslim beliefs? As in my mind, Khayyam is the first existentialist ever. That and how did this, I always want to know how I can figure about Khayyam philosophy and his influence in Iranian philosophy and in Iranian philosophical mindset. Mm-hmm. And thank you.
You're welcome. Well, Shadi, those are excellent points, and I think you're absolutely right that in the Khayyami poetry, there is a kind of existentialism avant la lettre. It's before the word existed. Just as people have argued that it's there in Shakespeare as well. I think that the poetry has that corner to it of an existentialist kind of despair about meaning, maybe finding meaning in the transcendence of everyday life, the things that we have a tendency to think of high and low when we come to meaning. So there's the heavenly choir and the high virtues, and then there's, going to a party with friends and maybe getting a little tipsy. Well, this poetry breaks down that dichotomy. It says that you can find transcendence with your friends, getting a little tipsy, or you can find transcendence with a lover. And so there is this kind of existentialist sense to it. Some of the poetry in it, though, is just ordinary pious poetry. That's why I think it's an anthology by different people. Some of the sensibilities are more Sufi, some of them are more secular. But even the Sufi, corner to the poetry is a little bit existentialist. So there's a poem that says that, the seeker started looking for the kalam, the pen that God wrote the universe out with, and the tablet on which it wrote in the sky above. But then his master told him, no, those things are inside you. So that's a very common Sufi trope, but it also fits in with the skeptical side of the poetry, that it's a critique of conventional kind of literalist religion.
And how much, based on your your historical reading, this has affected Iranian philosophical mindset in general?
Well, I think it has been important because certainly whatever we academics now think, most Iranian thinkers of the last 2 centuries have thought the poetry was by the astronomer Khayyam. So for instance, Sadiq Hedayat collected some of this poetry. He was an existentialist, of course, and very directly so because he was influenced by French thought. And I think there's also kind of some Buddhist sentiment in the poetry, and it was because it's from the Ilkhanid period when there was Buddhism in Iran that, you know, life is fleeting and so forth. And Hedayat also was attracted by Buddhism. You know, the Khorasanis used to be Buddhists, so it was part of his Iranian nationalism to, you know, recuperate Iranian Buddhism from the Arab Muslims. So, yeah, I think in the same way that very secular writers like Thomas Hardy, who was a novelist, wrote Jude the Obscure, and was a big Darwinist and really didn't believe in religion, some of the modern Iranian writers who had those tendencies like Hedayat also kind of grounded themselves, you know, indigenously in the Rubaiyat.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. This brings us to our next question from El Miran. Quote, do you see Omar Khayyam, his scientific aspect of personality and his poems, evidence of the science versus religion mindset of his, unquote?
Yes, I think that it's one of the themes of this genre of poetry, and I'm arguing it's a genre. So I could have chosen a different collection of the poetry, but it would have had very similar themes. One of the themes is a fight, not so much between religion and science, because religion is a big phenomenon, but between science and what the poetry, I think, would see as narrow-minded religion. Religion that is willing to set aside reason in the interests of dogma and again, the minutiae of law. I have to tell you, I was shocked when I read this poem that said, "Sonat makon, don't pay any attention to the Sunnah. The Sunnah is really important in Islam, but it says don't do it. Rather, you know, be nice to people, take care of people, do favors for people." So I think the critique of astrology is part of this, and as I said, I think the critique of astrology is, in a way, a Trojan horse. It's a way of critiquing superstition in religion without getting into trouble. And it's something that to keep in mind is that the time that this poetry was being produced, a lot of these sentiments were dangerous. I mean, people could get in trouble. They could be punished by the clergy or the king for saying these things. And there's another reason that they were attributed to Omar Khayyam, because if you wrote a poem critiquing the ulama and it went out under your name, then, you know, it could come back on you. But if you said, look, well, I found this nice old poem by Omar Khayyam, let's see what it says, then people won't take it so seriously because you have given it to a frame author, and then maybe you also won't go to jail.
Great. So we're going to be calling on Nader. Nader, you're up. Nader?
Okay,
Nader?
can you hear me? Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this very exciting and very interesting discussion. I'm not an expert in Persian literature, even though I am Iranian, and I think you know probably much more about Persian literature than most of us on this call. I have a little Khayyam book next to my bed, and every evening I try to maybe read a few pages and a few, or at least try to memorize some of them. And the Persian that I read is almost the same Persian as we speak today. I was kind of intrigued by what you said, that you set out to write a new translation of Khayyam because Fitzgerald's English was kind of very arcane and no longer people couldn't really understand it very much. But reading Persian poetry, be it Rumi, be it Khayyam, and even Ferdowsi, and the Persian is very it's as if it is today's Persian. But when you read Persian prose, that's not the case. Persian prose is very difficult to read for people like myself who are not, trained in that. What do you attribute this to, that we have kind of, in a way, kept the poetic language, or we are, the poetic language continues to be very, today's Persian, but not the written language? And why has Persian not changed so much as, for instance, other languages have changed? Thank you so much.
Well, you're very welcome. It's an excellent point. And in fact, in the Ilkhanid period, literary people noticed that Rubaiyat, or quatrains, were very popular among the people because they often used this relatively simple language. And it's a language that's, as you say, is still accessible today. That's why I thought, Fitzgerald's tendency to bring in Shakespearean diction or a very high diction was in some ways a betrayal of the poetry, because it's not. It's everyday speech of its time. Why languages change is an important issue in history. A lot of it has and so the old Pahlavi language, or Middle Persian, developed into what is called New Persian after the Arab invasions, and Arabic words were imported. When you have a conqueror who speaks a different language than the local people, they have to find ways of communicating, even of trading. So each will maybe cut off some of the more difficult grammar. So English simplified out. It used to be like German. It had a dative, and it was very difficult grammatically, but it simplified out when the French Normans conquered it. And I think the same thing happened with Hindi and Persian in India, that Urdu developed as a way for people to navigate between more Sanskrit kinds of language and Persian in the military camps and so forth. So English hasn't changed that much for the last 3 centuries. We dropped the, for to, for you, but it hasn't changed that much, but it changed quite a lot with the Norman invasion. So I think what happened was that Iran, after the Arab conquest, was not conquered by large numbers of people with whom you had to communicate. There were Turkic invasions, there were the Mongol invasions. The Mongols were probably very thin on the ground. There weren't very many of them. And so they very quickly adopted Persian when they were in Iran. And we think, the Hazara people in Afghanistan are the descendants of those Mongols who adopted Persian. Another thing that fixes language is literature. If you have classics in a language and they're taught from generation to generation, that can help to fix the language. Of course, New Persian, the Persian that developed in the 800s, 900s, thousands of the Common Era after the Arab conquests, produced a large amount of very important literature. You have Attar, you have Rumi, you have so many important authors that were then taught to each generation. I mean, all over the Middle East and Central Asia and South Asia, sort of the area from the Balkans to Bangladesh, young men primarily, although sometimes women as well, were made to memorize Sa'di. for 1,000 years. I mean, that was what education was. And it's amusing that when the British conquered India, one of the first things they did in Calcutta was to set up a school where the British administrators studied Sa'di. So that helps to fix the language too, when there are classics that everybody has to learn.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This brings us to our last question from the audience, from A. Will there be an audiobook available in the future?
Well, I will take that up with my publisher. It's done by the IB Tauris imprint, which now has been bought out by Bloomsbury in London, and I will certainly press them on that. I do want it to be accessible to people.
Wonderful. I'm very excited to get hold of the audiobook when it comes out. And that's going to be very exciting. I hope it works out. Now this ends the Q&A portion from the audience. Thank you everyone for joining us. We're now going to close out with longtime NIAC member Ali Fatemi, who will say why he's involved and why you should get involved with NIAC.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
First of all, thank you very much, Professor Cole. That was enlightening. Thank you. So my name is Ali Fatemi, and I live in Chicago. Like Professor Cole, I'm a lifetime academic. Since 1998, I've lived in Chicago. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself in response to the question that Miriam wanted me to answer, and that is, why do I support NIAC? So I came to Chicago in 1998 as a newly appointed chair of the finance department at DePaul University, a department of fairly good size, some 22 full-time faculty members and so on. And if you now file that, moving forward, we go to 2001 and the tragic events of 9/11. And in the aftermath of 9/11, one day I was crossing the street, going to my office, and in that heavy presence of security forces in Chicago, I locked eyes with one security personnel who was piercing in the way he was looking at me. And that sent chills down my bones that here I am, and in this hysteria of post 9/11, I look like a Middle Eastern, I look like an Iranian, and this guy just won't let go of evaluating me, profiling me in the most obvious way. Well, I crossed the street, went to my office, nothing horrible happened. But this was always in the back of my mind. Fast forward, we go a year or two later, and I got a letter from the founders of NIAC, Trita Parsi, that most of you know. I know that Professor Cole knows him well, about an invitation to join a discussion of the need for establishing an Iranian-American organization in support of the rights of Iranian Americans. And I jumped at that. That was absolutely no question in my mind that I would want to hear what that organization was about, what it was going to do. So in a nondescript hotel room that Trita and his colleagues had rented, I sat there and I listened to this idea that the Iranian Americans in the post 9/11 era needed a voice of Iranian Americans to protect their rights. And I knew that there was absolutely no way that I would turn my back on any organization that would want to get that accomplished. And I'm happy to say that since that day, I have been a supporter of NIAC, and I continue to support it in whatever way I can. I served on the board of NIAC for a while. I've been financial supporter, continue to do that. And there's actually a little bit more in terms of what I told you about myself. So I teach finance, and one of the things that I teach my students is that you should invest where you see the greatest return on your investment. And for my dollar, the greatest return on my investment for an organization that protects the rights of Iranian Americans is NIAC. I still have to find another organization that would do a better job of it. So in short, that's the reason why I support NIAC. I hope that if you're out there and you're debating whether you should join NIAC or support it, I hope that you think about it long and hard. There is no other organization that does a better job of protecting your rights. And thank you for your consideration. Thank you for listening. That's it.
Wow, thank you so much, Ali. That was really well said. Members like you make NIAC such a wonderful and vibrant organization. A big shout out to the NIAC headquarters team for supporting NIAC Chicago and helping make this event possible. And wow, thank you so much, Professor Cole, for that amazing presentation and answering our questions today. That was super interesting. I really learned so much from you today. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And don't forget to please make sure to buy Juan's new book. And I really, really enjoyed reading it, By the Beach on Lake Michigan. I also highly encourage you to please sign up to be a NIAC member today. For those who live in the Chicago area and the state of Illinois, please sign up to be a member through the membership form provided in the chat box, and your email will be added to the NIAC Chicago email listserv. For those of you who don't live in Illinois, the link has a full list of chapters as well. Any donation you make to NIAC will also help us build more power and make a direct impact on the policies that affect us most. Donation link in the chat box. It's time to get involved now. Thank you so much, everyone, and happy summer solstice. Thank you.